Hey guys, Rusty Historian here, and tonight we're diving into something that's going to make you appreciate your morning coffee, your toilet paper, and honestly, just being alive in the 21st century. We're talking about why you wouldn't last a day in ancient Greece. Now, before you get too comfortable in that gaming chair or wherever you're watching this from, hit that like button if you enjoy these kinds of deep dives into history's darker corners. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. It's good to know you and to feel that the work we put into these videos is being seen. All right, dim the lights, maybe grab a snack, though you might lose your appetite by the end of this, and let's jump in. Picture this. You wake up tomorrow morning, but instead of your alarm clock blaring some pop song, you hear the sound of roosters crowing, donkeys braying, and someone next door emptying their chamber pot directly into the street. Congratulations. You've just been transported to Athens, circa 450 BCE, the so-called Golden Age of Greece. You know that time period your high school history teacher probably gushed about? Democracy, philosophy, beautiful marble statues, the cradle of Western civilization. Yeah, well, nobody told you about the smell. You open your eyes, and the first thing that hits you isn't the sight of ancient Greece, it's the stench. It's a cocktail of unwashed human bodies, animal waste, rotting food scraps, and something that might charitably be called urban decay, but is really just the accumulated funk of a city with zero understanding of sanitation. Your nose is burning, your eyes are watering, and you haven't even gotten out of bed yet. Speaking of bed, congratulations. You're lying on what amounts to a thin mat stuffed with straw, probably crawling with more insects than a nature documentary. The ancient Greeks didn't have box springs, memory foam, or even basic cotton sheets. If you were lucky enough to be middle class, you might have a wooden bed frame. If you were poor, which, let's be honest, you probably would be, you're sleeping on the floor. The room you're in, it's small, dark, and has exactly one tiny window with no glass, because glass windows wouldn't become common for another 1,000 years or so. The walls are made of sun-dried brick that's crumbling in places. And there's no central heating because, surprise, that hasn't been invented yet either. It's winter in Athens, and the temperature inside your house is basically the same as outside, which is to say, freezing. The only heat source is a small brazier in the middle of the room, essentially a metal bowl filled with burning charcoal. This gives you three options: freeze to death, suffocate from carbon monoxide poisoning, or burn the house down. Choose wisely. You stumble to your feet, and immediately your back screams in protest. That straw mattress offered about as much support as a wet paper towel. Your joints ache, your muscles are stiff, and you feel like you've been hit by a cart, which, given ancient Greek roads, is entirely possible. Now comes the fun part: getting dressed. If you're a man, you get to wear what's essentially a long tunic called a chiton. It's basically a bedsheet with armholes. If you're a woman, congratulations. You get the same thing, but longer and with more restrictions on where you can wear it. Which is to say, almost nowhere, because women in ancient Athens had about as many rights as furniture. But we'll get to that delightful aspect of Greek society later. The fabric? It's probably wool, which means it's scratchy, absorbs odors like a sponge, and when it gets wet, which it will because you'll be sweating constantly, it becomes a walking advertisement for why synthetic fibers were invented. Oh, and those beautiful flowing robes you see in movies? Yeah, they were white. Do you know how hard it is to keep white fabric clean when your city doubles as an open sewer? It's like playing life on expert mode, except the penalty for failure is looking like you rolled around in a barnyard, which, let's be honest, you basically have. Now, let's talk about personal hygiene, or rather, the complete lack thereof. You haven't brushed your teeth because toothbrushes won't exist for another 2 millennia. The ancient Greeks sometimes chewed on twigs or used rough cloths to scrub their teeth, but dental hygiene was about as advanced as their space program. Which is to say, non-existent. Your breath smells like a combination of rotting fish, garlic, and despair. Your teeth, if you still have them, are probably yellow, black, or missing entirely. Dental decay was so common that many people just accepted tooth loss as an inevitable part of aging. Some were lucky enough to reach their 30s with a full set of teeth. But hey, at least everyone else smells terrible too, so you blend right in. Bathing? Well, that's complicated. The Greeks did value cleanliness, sort of. But their version of a bath would make a modern germaphobe weep. Public baths existed, but they were basically communal cesspools where dozens of people shared the same water. Imagine a hot tub, but instead of chlorine, it's seasoned with the accumulated dirt, sweat, and bodily fluids of everyone who used it before you. Private baths were for the wealthy, and even then, private meant you shared the water with your entire household. Servants, slaves, family members, everyone got the same water, just in descending order of social importance. The soap situation is even worse. They didn't have soap. Instead, they used olive oil mixed with sand or ash to scrub their skin. Imagine rubbing yourself down with cooking oil and playground sand, and you'll get the idea. It's exfoliation taken to a masochistic extreme. Your skin is now raw, oily, and probably infected in several places. But wait, there's more. Let's talk about what passes for a bathroom in ancient Athens. You know that phrase, when in Rome, do as the Romans do? Well, when in Athens, you squat over a hole in the ground and hope for the best. Public latrines were essentially rows of holes cut into stone benches with no partitions for privacy. You'd sit shoulder to shoulder with strangers, conducting your business while making small talk about the weather or politics. It was the ancient equivalent of a coffee shop, except instead of laptops and lattes, it was bowel movements and bad smells. And toilet paper? The Greeks used stones, pottery shards, or sticks. Sometimes they splurged on sea sponges attached to sticks, which were shared. That's right, communal butt-wiping implements. The same sponge that cleaned your neighbor's behind was coming for yours next. The sponges were kept in a bucket of salt water between uses, which was the ancient Greek equivalent of sanitization. Spoiler alert, it wasn't very effective. Private homes had chamber pots, which were basically ceramic bowls that collected human waste. These were emptied into the streets, usually from second-story windows, often without warning the pedestrians below. Walking through Athens was like playing a real-life version of Frogger, except instead of cars, you're dodging flying excrement. The phrase, watch out below, takes on a whole new meaning in ancient Greece. Now, you might think, okay, this is gross, but surely the food will be good, right? Mediterranean cuisine is amazing. Oh, sweet summer child, we need to talk about breakfast. You stumble out of your home, and into the streets of Athens, desperately hoping to find something edible. The sun is barely up, but the city is already alive with the sounds of merchants hawking their wares, animals bleating and neighing, and the general cacophony of urban life without noise regulations. The first thing you notice is that there are no coffee shops, no Starbucks, no local roastery, no drive-thru for a quick caffeine fix. Coffee hasn't been invented yet. Tea is something that exists only in far-off China and won't make it to Europe for centuries. Your morning beverage options are water, which we'll discuss in horrifying detail later, wine or diluted wine. Yes, the ancient Greeks started drinking alcohol with breakfast, not because they were all alcoholics, but because it was literally safer than water. Let's talk about that water situation, shall we? The water supply in ancient Athens came from wells, springs, and cisterns that collected rainwater. Sounds reasonable, right? Except these same water sources were contaminated by the human and animal waste that was dumped into the streets. The runoff from all that sewage had to go somewhere, and that somewhere was often the same place people got their drinking water. Waterborne diseases were rampant. Cholera, dysentery, typhoid. These weren't just medical curiosities, they were everyday realities. People were constantly sick from drinking contaminated water, which is why wine became the beverage of choice. The alcohol killed some of the bacteria, making it relatively safer than straight water. So congratulations, you're about to become a functional alcoholic by necessity. But even the wine isn't what you'd expect. Ancient Greek wine was thick, syrupy, and incredibly strong, so strong that drinking it straight was considered barbaric. They mixed it with water, usually in a 3:1 or 2:1 ratio of water to wine. The problem? The water they mixed it with was still contaminated. It's like trying to solve a poison problem by adding more poison, but in a different flavor. Now, about that breakfast. The typical Greek breakfast consisted of bread dipped in wine. That's it. Sometimes they might add a bit of cheese or olives if they were feeling fancy. The bread was coarse, dense, and made from barley rather than wheat, because wheat was expensive. Barley bread had the texture and nutritional value of cardboard, and probably tasted about the same. The olives were preserved in salt brine so concentrated it could probably melt metal. Each bite was like getting punched in the mouth by the ocean. But hey, at least they were rich in healthy fats, right? The cheese was made from goat or sheep milk. Cow's milk was rare because cows were expensive to maintain. It was often aged in caves or underground storage areas where the temperature and humidity created perfect conditions for all sorts of interesting mold growths. Some of these molds were beneficial, creating what we'd recognize as blue cheese. Others were less beneficial. Food poisoning was basically a rite of passage in ancient Greece. But let's say you wanted something more substantial than bread and wine. Maybe some protein to start your day. Well, meat was incredibly expensive and usually reserved for religious festivals or special occasions. The average person might eat meat a few times a year if they were lucky. Fish was more common, especially in coastal cities like Athens. But refrigeration didn't exist, so fish had to be eaten immediately after being caught or preserved with salt. Fresh fish often meant caught yesterday and starting to turn, while preserved fish was so salty it could cause kidney damage. Eggs were available, but chickens were still relatively new to Greece. They'd only been introduced from Asia a few centuries earlier. Eggs were smaller than modern chicken eggs and often came with surprise extras like partially developed chicks inside. Nothing quite ruins your appetite like cracking open an egg and finding a tiny beak staring back at you. Fruits and vegetables? Sure, if you could afford them and they were in season. But in season was a much narrower window than today. No greenhouses, no global shipping, no preserved produce. When grapes were in season, you ate grapes. When they weren't, you went without. Same with figs, apples, pears, and vegetables. Most vegetables were bitter, tough, and smaller than their modern counterparts. Selective breeding hadn't yet created the sweet, tender produce we're used to. A Greek tomato. Oh wait, tomatoes hadn't been discovered yet. They were still chilling in South America, completely unknown to Europeans. Same with potatoes, corn, chocolate, vanilla, sugar, and dozens of other foods we consider essential. The ancient Greek diet was monotonous, nutritionally questionable, and guaranteed to leave you hungry within an hour. But hey, at least you're getting plenty of olive oil, right? Olive oil was the cooking fat of choice, used for everything from frying to lamp fuel. The same oil that cooked your food also lit your house and waterproofed your clothes. Multitasking at its finest. The problem is that olive oil goes rancid quickly in hot weather, and ancient Greeks had no way to prevent this. Rancid oil doesn't just taste bad, it can cause stomach problems, nausea, and other digestive issues. Every meal was a game of Russian roulette with your intestinal tract. And speaking of your digestive system, ancient Greeks had no understanding of food safety, bacteria, or proper food storage. They ate with their hands, the same hands they used for everything else, including personal hygiene, and shared food from common bowls and plates. Cross-contamination wasn't just likely, it was inevitable. So you finish your breakfast of stale barley bread, rancid olive oil, nuclear-strength olives, and questionable wine, and your stomach is already churning. But the day is just beginning. You need to find work. Because unless you were born into wealth, which statistically speaking you definitely weren't, you need to earn money to survive. And working in ancient Athens was about as pleasant as everything else we've discussed so far, which is to say it was absolutely terrible. So you've survived breakfast. Congratulations. That puts you ahead of many ancient Greeks who succumbed to food poisoning before noon. Now it's time to find work, because unlike the wealthy elite who spent their days philosophizing and attending symposiums, regular people had to actually earn a living. The job market in ancient Athens was limited. Your options basically boiled down to farming, crafts, trade, military service, or slavery. And if you think that last one doesn't count as a job option, you're forgetting that roughly 1/3 of Athens' population consisted of slaves. Those aren't great odds. Now let's start with farming, since that's what most people did. If you were a farmer in ancient Greece, your life was a constant battle against nature, the weather, and basic physics. The soil in much of Greece is rocky, thin, and not particularly fertile. It's mountain country, which means you're trying to grow crops on steep slopes with minimal topsoil. Your main crops were the Mediterranean triad: grains, mostly barley, olives, and grapes. This sounds idyllic until you realize that all three are incredibly labor-intensive and completely at the mercy of the weather. Grain farming meant plowing fields with a wooden plow pulled by oxen, if you were lucky enough to own oxen. If not, you got to pull the plow yourself. The plow itself was basically a sharpened stick that scratched the surface of the earth. It didn't actually turn the soil over like modern plows, so you had to go over the same ground multiple times. Your back is now permanently bent into a question mark. Sowing was done by hand, scattering seeds and hoping they'd take root before birds, rodents, or insects ate them all. There were no pesticides, no fertilizers, no genetically modified crops designed to resist pests and diseases. You planted your barley and prayed to Demeter that something would grow. The harvesting was done with a sickle, a curved blade attached to a short handle. You bent over for hours, cutting grain stalks one by one in the blazing Mediterranean sun. Your hands were covered in blisters and cuts from the sharp stalks. Your back screamed in agony, and you were surrounded by clouds of dust and chaff that made breathing almost impossible. And that's assuming you had a good harvest. Bad weather, disease, or pests could wipe out an entire year's work in a matter of days. Crop failure meant starvation, and starvation meant death. It was that simple. Olive farming was equally brutal. Olive trees take years to mature and produce fruit, and they only produce a good harvest every other year. The olives had to be picked by hand, climbing up into thorny branches to shake down the fruit. The oil extraction process involved crushing the olives under massive stone wheels, usually powered by animals or slaves walking in circles for hours. The work was dangerous, monotonous, and offered no guarantees. A late frost, an insect infestation, or a disease could destroy your entire olive grove overnight. Grape farming meant dealing with one of the most finicky crops ever cultivated. Grapes need exactly the right amount of sun, rain, and temperature to produce good wine. Too much rain and the grapes rot on the vine. Too little rain and they shrivel up. Too hot and they turn to raisins. Too cold and the vines freeze. And unlike modern vintners who have centuries of scientific knowledge about winemaking, ancient Greeks were basically guessing their way through the process. Bad wine was common, good wine was rare, and great wine was a miracle. But let's say farming isn't for you. Maybe you're more of a city person? Well, urban jobs in ancient Athens weren't much better. If you had a craft skill, pottery, metalworking, carpentry, weaving, you could set up shop in the agora, marketplace, and try to make a living. The problem was that every other craftsperson had the same idea, so competition was fierce, and profit margins were razor thin. Let's take pottery, for example. Pottery was essential in ancient Greece. They used ceramic vessels for everything from storing wine and oil to carrying water and cooking food. But being a potter meant working with clay, which had to be dug from local deposits, cleaned, prepared, and shaped entirely by hand. The potter's wheel existed, but it was a simple stone disc that you spun with your feet while trying to shape clay with your hands. Your legs were constantly moving, your back was bent over the wheel, and your hands were perpetually covered in wet clay and mud. The firing process was equally challenging. Kilns were basically large clay ovens heated with wood or charcoal. Temperature control was achieved by adding or removing fuel and adjusting air vents, all by guesswork and experience. Too hot and your pottery cracked or melted. Too cool and it remained soft and porous. A single mistake could destroy hours or days of work. Metalworking was even more dangerous. Bronze and iron working required extremely hot fires, hot enough to melt metal and hot enough to kill you if you weren't careful. The forges were fueled by charcoal and required constant bellows work to maintain temperature. You spent your days standing next to fires hot enough to melt copper while breathing in toxic fumes from burning charcoal and heated metals. Heat stroke, burns, and respiratory problems were occupational hazards. Many metalworkers developed lung diseases from inhaling metal particles and smoke. And let's not forget that all this work was done without safety equipment. No protective eyewear, no heat-resistant gloves, no ventilation systems. If you were lucky, you might have a leather apron to protect your clothes. Your skin and lungs were on their own. Carpentry required working with hand tools, saws, chisels, hammers, that were much cruder than modern equivalents. Wood had to be cut and shaped entirely by muscle power. Measurements were done by eye or with simple rulers. Complex joints and precise fits were achievements of skill and luck. And accidents were common. Cut yourself with a saw or chisel and you had no antibiotics, no sterile bandages, no emergency rooms. You wrapped the wound in whatever cloth was available and hoped it didn't get infected. If it did get infected, amputation was often the only treatment option. If you survived the amputation. Weaving was considered women's work, which tells you something about how ancient Greeks valued both weaving and women. Women spent their days hunched over looms, working with wool thread that had to be spun by hand from raw fleece. The process started with cleaning raw wool, which involved picking out dirt, burrs, insects, and other debris by hand. Then the wool was combed to align the fibers, spun into thread on a spindle, and finally woven into cloth on a loom. This entire process, from sheep to finished cloth, could take weeks or months for a single garment. And women were expected to do this work while also managing households, raising children, and generally being invisible to the male-dominated society. But maybe you're thinking, I'll just become a merchant. Buy low, sell high, make a profit. Oh, you sweet, naive time traveler. Trade in ancient Greece was incredibly dangerous and completely unpredictable. Most goods were transported by sea, which meant putting your entire investment onto wooden ships that were constantly at risk of sinking, piracy, or simple navigational errors. Ancient Greek ships were basically floating wooden boxes with sails. They had no compasses, no accurate maps, no weather forecasting, and no radio communication. Navigation was done by following coastlines and using the stars when the stars were visible. Storms could sink your ship and cargo without warning. Pirates could attack and steal everything you owned. Corrupt officials at ports could confiscate your goods on trumped-up charges. Wars could break out overnight, making trade routes impassable. Even if everything went perfectly, profit margins were small and competition was intense. Success in trade required not just business acumen, but also incredible luck and perfect timing. And if you failed, if your ship sank, if pirates robbed you, if your cargo spoiled, there was no insurance, no bankruptcy protection, no safety net. You lost everything and probably ended up as a slave or beggar. Speaking of which, let's talk about slavery, because it's impossible to understand ancient Greek work life without addressing the elephant in the room. Slavery wasn't just accepted in ancient Greece, it was fundamental to the entire economic system. Slaves did much of the manual labor that kept society functioning. They worked in mines, on farms, in households, and in workshops. But here's the thing about slavery in ancient Greece. It wasn't necessarily based on race or ethnicity like later American slavery. You could become a slave through debt, capture in war, piracy, or simply being born to slave parents. This meant that virtually anyone could end up enslaved. That merchant whose business failed? Slave. That farmer whose crops failed and couldn't pay his debts? Slave. That soldier captured in battle? Slave. That child whose parents couldn't afford to feed them? Sold into slavery. The line between free and enslaved was often thinner than people realized. Slaves had no rights, no protection under the law, and no hope of retirement or freedom unless their owner chose to grant it. They could be bought, sold, beaten, or killed at their owner's whim. They worked until they died or became too old or sick to be useful. And here's the really dark part. Even free workers were often treated only marginally better than slaves. They had legal rights in theory, but in practice, economic desperation made those rights meaningless. If you were a poor farmer or craftsman barely scraping by, you had about as much bargaining power as a slave. You took whatever work was available at whatever wage was offered, because the alternative was starvation. So whether you were free or enslaved, work in ancient Athens was brutal, dangerous, and often deadly. Your body was a tool to be used up and discarded when it broke down. Workplace safety was non-existent, workers' rights were unheard of, and retirement was something that happened when you died. But hey, at least when the workday ended, you could go home and relax, right? Wrong. Because we haven't even talked about what passed for healthcare in ancient Greece. And trust me, you don't want to get sick or injured in a world where the height of medical knowledge is balance your humors and try not to die. Okay, so you've made it through breakfast without dying of food poisoning, and you've survived a day of backbreaking labor without losing any limbs. You're probably feeling pretty proud of yourself right about now. But then you wake up the next morning with a splitting headache, a fever, and a nasty cough that's bringing up blood. Congratulations! You're sick in ancient Athens, where the medical motto was, first, do no harm. Actually, scratch that. Let's just wing it and see what happens. Let's start with the good news. Ancient Greece did produce Hippocrates, often called the father of medicine, who established some of the fundamental principles of medical practice that we still follow today. The Hippocratic Oath, with its promise to do no harm, is still taken by doctors. Now for the bad news. Hippocrates lived around 370 BCE, and most of his revolutionary ideas about medicine, like the radical concept that diseases might have natural causes rather than being punishment from the gods, were still pretty new and not widely accepted. Even worse news, you're probably not going to be treated by Hippocrates or one of his trained followers. You're going to be treated by whatever passes for a local healer, whose medical knowledge consists of folk remedies, superstitions, and guesswork, seasoned with a generous helping of wishful thinking. The prevailing medical theory of the time was the theory of humors, which held that the human body contained 4 basic fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Health was supposedly achieved by keeping these 4 humors in perfect balance, while disease was caused by having too much or too little of one humor. This theory was completely wrong, but it formed the basis of medical practice for the next 2,000 years. According to humor theory, your fever and cough indicated an excess of hot, moist humors that needed to be cooled and dried. The prescribed treatment? Bloodletting. That's right. When you were already weak and sick, the cure was to make you weaker by draining your blood. Ancient Greek doctors used a variety of methods to accomplish this, including cutting veins with sharp knives, applying leeches, or using a procedure called cupping, where heated cups were placed on the skin to create suction and draw blood to the surface. The logic was that removing the bad blood would restore the natural balance of humors and cure your illness. The actual result was usually to make sick people sicker and weak people weaker. But hey, at least the theory was internally consistent. If bloodletting didn't work, and it rarely did, the next step was purging. This involved giving the patient powerful laxatives and emetics, drugs that induce vomiting, to empty their digestive system of harmful humors. Picture this. You're already sick with fever and cough, and now you're violently vomiting and having explosive diarrhea, while a doctor stands over you, nodding sagely and explaining how this is definitely going to cure you. The dehydration and electrolyte imbalance caused by this treatment killed more patients than most of the original diseases. But let's say you didn't get sick. Let's say you just injured yourself. Maybe you cut your hand while working, or you fell and broke a bone. Surely ancient Greek medicine was better at treating injuries than diseases, right? Well, sort of. Sometimes, if you were incredibly lucky. Wound care in ancient Greece consisted of cleaning the injury with wine. The alcohol did provide some antiseptic effect, applying various herbal poultices and wrapping it with cloth bandages. Some of these herbal treatments were actually effective. Willow bark, for example, contains compounds similar to aspirin and could help with pain and inflammation. But many others were useless or actively harmful. Popular wound treatments included applying honey, actually not bad, crushed garlic, decent antiseptic properties, spider webs, surprisingly effective at stopping bleeding, and various combinations of animal dung, urine, and rotted organic matter. Absolutely terrible ideas that caused infections. The problem was that ancient Greek healers had no way to distinguish between treatments that worked and those that didn't. If a patient recovered, the healer got credit regardless of whether their treatment helped or made things worse. If the patient died, well, that was the will of the gods. Surgical procedures were even more terrifying. Ancient Greek surgeons could perform some basic operations, removing arrows or spear points, setting broken bones, even some abdominal surgery in desperate cases. But they had no anesthesia beyond wine and opium, if they could get it, no understanding of infection control, and no knowledge of anatomy beyond what they could observe from war wounds and animal dissections. Imagine having surgery while fully conscious, with no pain relief except alcohol, performed by someone using non-sterile instruments who learned anatomy by poking around inside dead bodies and wounded soldiers. The mortality rate for surgical procedures was astronomical. Most people died either from the pain and shock of the operation itself or from infections that developed afterward. Surgery was literally a last resort when the patient was going to die anyway. Broken bones were set by feel and held in place with splints made from wood, leather, or cloth. There were no x-rays to check alignment, no way to tell if bones were healing properly, and no understanding that immobilization was crucial for proper healing. Many broken bones healed crooked, leaving people permanently disabled. Infection in broken bones could lead to amputation, performed without anesthesia, using saws and knives that were also used for carpentry and food preparation. Dental care was equally primitive. Toothaches were treated by pulling the tooth with crude forceps, again without anesthesia. Dental abscesses could easily become life-threatening infections that spread to the brain or bloodstream. There were no root canals, no fillings, no crowns. If your tooth hurt, it came out. If the extraction got infected, you might die. It was that simple. Mental illness was barely recognized as a medical condition. People with what we would now call depression, anxiety, schizophrenia, or bipolar disorder were often thought to be possessed by spirits or cursed by the gods. Treatment consisted of religious rituals, exorcisms, or simply being chained up to prevent them from harming themselves or others. The famous healing temples of Asclepius, the Greek god of medicine, were essentially ancient hospitals where sick people came to be cured through divine intervention. Patients would sleep in the temple and hope that the god would visit them in dreams and either cure them directly or provide guidance about treatment. Some of these temples did provide actual medical care alongside their religious rituals, and the peaceful environment probably helped some patients recover, but many others died while waiting for divine intervention that never came. Childbirth was incredibly dangerous for both mother and baby. The maternal mortality rate was probably around 1 in 10 births, meaning that if you were a woman in ancient Greece, you had roughly a 10% chance of dying each time you gave birth. Midwives had some practical knowledge about delivery, but they had no understanding of infection control, no way to handle complications like breech births or placental problems, and no surgical options for emergencies. Babies who survived birth faced their own medical challenges. Infant mortality was around 30 to 40%, meaning that roughly 1 in 3 babies died before their first birthday. Many succumbed to infectious diseases, malnutrition, or simple exposure to the elements. Those who survived infancy weren't out of the woods. Childhood diseases like measles, smallpox, whooping cough, and diphtheria killed thousands of children every year. There were no vaccines, no antibiotics, no specialized pediatric care. Parents in ancient Greece couldn't count on their children surviving to adulthood. It was common for families to have many children, partly because they expected several to die young. Even if you survived childhood and avoided serious injuries or illnesses, your life expectancy was still dramatically shorter than today. The average lifespan in ancient Greece was probably around 35-40 years, and that's including people who lived to old age. Many factors contributed to this short lifespan: poor nutrition, hard physical labor, exposure to diseases, lack of medical care, and simple accidents that would be minor inconveniences today, but could be fatal in the ancient world. A simple cut could become infected and kill you. A broken bone could leave you crippled and unable to work, leading to starvation. A difficult childbirth could end 2 lives instead of bringing 1 into the world. And here's the thing that really puts ancient Greek medicine into perspective. Even the wealthy, who could afford the best medical care available at the time, died young and suffered from preventable diseases. Rich or poor, everyone was at the mercy of medical practices that were based more on superstition and tradition than on any real understanding of how the human body works. So you're sick, you're in pain, and the treatment available to you is more likely to kill you than cure you. Your only real options are to hope you get better on your own or to pray to the gods for divine intervention. But hey, at least when you're suffering through bloodletting and purging, you can distract yourself by thinking about all the other wonderful aspects of ancient Greek life. Like the legal system, which was almost as brutal as the medical care, because nothing says civilization quite like a justice system where trial by ordeal was considered a perfectly reasonable way to determine guilt or innocence. So you're sick, broke, exhausted, and smelling like a combination of rancid olive oil and human waste. But surely, you think, at least there's some kind of legal system to protect you from the worst abuses of ancient society, right? Oh, you beautiful, innocent child. Let me tell you about justice in ancient Athens, the birthplace of democracy and home to some of the most fascinatingly terrifying legal practices ever devised by human minds. First, the good news. Athens did have laws, courts, and legal procedures. They even invented the concept of trial by jury, which was pretty revolutionary for the time. Citizens had legal rights and could seek justice through established procedures, rather than relying on the whims of kings or nobles. Now for the bad news. The Athenian legal system was designed by and for adult male citizens, which excluded women, slaves, foreigners, and anyone under the age of 30. This meant that roughly 80% of the population had no legal rights whatsoever. If you were a woman, a slave, or a foreigner, you couldn't own property, vote, serve on juries, or even represent yourself in court. You were essentially legal nonentities, existing at the mercy of whatever adult male citizen was responsible for you. But let's say you were lucky enough to be an adult male citizen. Surely then the legal system would protect you, right? Well, maybe, if you could navigate a system that was part courtroom drama, part gambling den, and part gladiatorial arena. Athenian courts were massive affairs. Juries consisted of hundreds or sometimes thousands of citizens chosen by lottery. The idea was that large juries would be harder to bribe and would represent a broader cross-section of society. In practice, this meant that your fate was decided by a mob of your peers, who may or may not have been paying attention, who definitely didn't understand the law, and who were often more interested in the entertainment value of the trial than in actual justice. There were no professional judges, no law school graduates, no legal experts who spent years studying jurisprudence. Just a bunch of ordinary citizens who showed up that morning, got handed a bronze token, and were suddenly responsible for deciding whether you lived or died. The legal procedures were equally bizarre. There were no professional lawyers, so you had to represent yourself, unless you were wealthy enough to hire someone to write your speech for you. These speechwriters, called logographers, were skilled orators who could craft compelling arguments, but they weren't required to know anything about the law. Trials were timed with water clocks, giving each side a limited amount of time to present their case. Complex legal matters had to be explained in the same amount of time as simple disputes. Evidence was secondary to rhetoric, and the most persuasive speaker often won regardless of the facts. And here's where it gets really wild. There was no concept of beyond a reasonable doubt. Juries voted immediately after hearing the arguments, with no deliberation, no discussion, and no opportunity to ask questions or review evidence. They dropped bronze tokens into urns, one for guilty, one for innocent, and whatever side got more votes won. It was basically a popularity contest with life or death stakes. The punishments, when you were found guilty, were equally arbitrary. For many crimes, the penalty wasn't set by law but was decided through a second round of voting. The prosecution would propose one punishment, the defense would propose another, and the jury would choose between them. This led to some spectacularly bad strategic decisions. Defendants who proposed punishments that were too lenient risked having the jury choose the prosecution's harsher alternative. But those who proposed reasonable punishments might still lose if the jury felt they weren't taking their crimes seriously enough. Socrates, for example, was condemned to death partly because he refused to propose an alternative punishment that the jury would accept. When offered the chance to suggest exile or a fine, he sarcastically proposed that the city should give him free meals for life as a reward for his service to Athens. The jury was not amused. Speaking of death sentences, let's talk about the various ways ancient Athens could legally kill you. The most famous was hemlock poisoning, the method used to execute Socrates. Hemlock was considered a humane form of execution because it was relatively painless and allowed the condemned person to die with dignity. Other methods were less pleasant. Crucifixion was used for slaves and non-citizens. Stoning was employed for certain religious crimes. Beheading was quick but messy. And, for the worst offenses, there was always the option of being thrown into a pit and left to die slowly. But execution was actually the least of your worries if you ran afoul of Athenian law. There were plenty of punishments that were arguably worse than death. Exile, for instance, was considered one of the harshest penalties available. Being banished from Athens meant losing your citizenship, your property, your family connections, and your entire social identity. You became a wanderer with no legal protections, no community ties, and no way to earn a living in the only world you'd ever known. Many exiles chose suicide rather than face life as stateless outcasts. Then there was atimia, the loss of civic rights. Citizens who suffered atimia couldn't vote, serve on juries, speak in the assembly, or even enter the agora. They became social pariahs, shunned by their former friends, and reduced to a kind of civil death while still physically alive. For crimes involving money, there was debt slavery. If you couldn't pay a fine or make restitution, you could be enslaved to your creditor until the debt was worked off. Given the brutal working conditions and minimal compensation, this often meant slavery for life. Physical punishments were also common. Flogging, branding, and mutilation were used for various offenses. The theory was that visible punishment would serve as a deterrent to others, while also marking the criminal so everyone would know what they had done. But here's the truly terrifying part. Much of what passed for evidence in Athenian courts would be considered completely inadmissible today. Torture was routinely used to extract testimony from slaves, who were considered incapable of telling the truth unless they were in extreme pain. The logic was that fear of torture would prevent slaves from lying to protect their masters, and that physical agony would force them to reveal hidden truths. In reality, torture produced whatever testimony the interrogators wanted to hear. Slaves would say anything to make the pain stop, regardless of whether it was true. Superstition also played a major role in legal proceedings. Oaths were sworn by the gods, and perjury was considered not just a crime against the court, but a sin against the divine order. Witnesses were required to swear elaborate religious oaths before giving testimony. If someone refused to swear an oath, this was taken as evidence of guilt. If they swore falsely and were later discovered, they faced both legal punishment and divine retribution. The fear of angering the gods was often more effective than secular law in preventing false testimony. Trial by ordeal was used for certain types of cases, particularly those involving religious crimes or questions of divine favor. The accused might be required to walk over hot coals, plunge their hand into boiling water, or undergo some other painful test. If they survived unharmed, the gods had declared them innocent. If they were injured or died, that was proof of guilt. This system was obviously rigged against the poor and weak, who were more likely to be injured during ordeals and less likely to receive medical care afterward. But it was considered a perfectly valid way to determine divine judgment. Property crimes were handled differently depending on the social status of both the victim and the perpetrator. Stealing from a wealthy citizen carried much harsher penalties than stealing from a poor person. Slaves who stole from their masters could be executed, while masters who stole from slaves faced no legal consequences at all. Sexual crimes were equally skewed by social class and gender. Rape was primarily considered a property crime against the victim's male relatives, rather than a crime against the victim herself. The penalty for raping a free woman was often financial compensation to her father or husband. Raping a slave was usually treated as property damage, like breaking someone's furniture. The owner could seek compensation for the reduced value of their property, but there was no punishment for the actual assault. Adultery was taken more seriously than rape, but only when it involved a married woman. Men were expected to have sexual relationships with slaves, prostitutes, and unmarried women, but having an affair with another man's wife was a serious offense that could result in death. The wronged husband was legally entitled to kill both his wife and her lover if he caught them in the act. Alternatively, he could seek financial compensation or demand that the adulterer be publicly humiliated. Women who committed adultery faced much harsher consequences than men. They could be divorced, exiled, or even executed. They lost all rights to their children and property and were often reduced to prostitution as their only means of survival. Political crimes were treated with particular severity, partly because Athens was constantly threatened by foreign enemies and internal conspiracies. Treason, sedition, and corruption were capital offenses, and the definition of these crimes was broad enough to encompass almost any criticism of the government. The famous practice of ostracism was Athens' way of dealing with politicians who became too powerful or unpopular. Once a year, citizens could vote to exile one prominent person for 10 years, with no trial, no explanation, and no appeal. The process was supposedly designed to prevent tyranny by removing potentially dangerous leaders before they could seize power. In practice, it was often used to settle personal grudges or eliminate political rivals. Being ostracized wasn't technically a punishment for a crime, but it had the same effect as exile. The ostracized person lost their citizenship, property, and social connections, and became a pariah in their own homeland. Commercial disputes were handled by specialized courts that dealt with contracts, trade agreements, and financial transactions. But even these supposedly straightforward economic matters were complicated by the lack of standardized currency, banking systems, or commercial law. Contracts were often sealed with religious oaths rather than legal documents. Disputes were resolved by panels of arbitrators who were supposed to be experts in trade, but who often had their own financial interests in the outcome. Fraud was common and difficult to prove. Merchants could sell defective goods, traders could misrepresent their cargo, and moneylenders could charge illegal interest rates with little fear of prosecution. The punishment for commercial crimes was usually financial restitution, but collecting damages was often impossible if the guilty party had fled the city or hidden their assets. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Athenian law was how it treated the most vulnerable members of society. Children, women, slaves, and foreigners had virtually no legal protections and were subject to the absolute authority of adult male citizens. A father could legally kill his newborn child by exposure, leaving the baby outside to die from cold, hunger, or wild animals. This was considered a family matter rather than a crime, and no one could legally intervene. Women who were raped, beaten, or murdered by their husbands or male relatives had no legal recourse. They couldn't testify in court, couldn't own property, and couldn't seek protection from the authorities. Slaves could be killed, tortured, or sexually abused by their owners with complete impunity. They were considered property rather than people, and damaging someone else's slave was treated the same as breaking their tools or furniture. Foreigners who lived and worked in Athens had some legal protections, but they were always at the mercy of citizen prejudices and changing political winds. They could be expelled from the city at any time, for any reason, with no legal appeal. So there you have it. Justice in ancient Athens. It was arbitrary, brutal, and heavily biased in favor of wealthy male citizens. If you were lucky enough to be born into that privileged group, you had a fighting chance of receiving fair treatment. If you weren't, you were basically at the mercy of people who considered you less than human, and we haven't even talked about what happened when Athens went to war, which was often. Because nothing quite captures the essence of ancient Greek life like the constant threat of violent death in battles fought with bronze weapons and leather armor. But that's a whole other nightmare we'll explore next. All right, so you've survived the food, the disease, the working conditions, and the legal system of ancient Athens. You're probably thinking you've seen the worst that ancient Greece has to offer. You might even be getting a little cocky about your chances of survival. Well, buckle up, because we need to talk about war. And in ancient Greece, war wasn't something that happened occasionally to other people in distant places. It was a constant, brutal reality that could literally show up at your city gates any morning without warning. The Greeks didn't have professional armies in the modern sense. Instead, they relied on citizen soldiers called hoplites, basically regular guys who owned enough property to afford weapons and armor. If you were a middle-class male citizen, congratulations. You were automatically drafted into military service whenever your city-state needed an army, which was often, very often. Greek city-states fought each other constantly over territory, trade routes, political influence, and sometimes just out of pure spite. Athens fought Sparta for decades in the Peloponnesian War. Sparta fought Thebes. Thebes fought Athens. Everyone fought Macedonia. And when they weren't fighting each other, they were fighting off invasions from Persia, Celtic tribes, or whoever else felt like conquering some Greeks that week. As a hoplite, you were expected to provide your own equipment: a bronze breastplate, a bronze helmet, bronze greaves, shin guards, a large round shield, hoplon, a long spear, dory, and a short sword as backup. This gear was expensive, the equivalent of several months' wages for a skilled craftsman. If you couldn't afford the full set, you went to war anyway with whatever you could scrounge up: leather armor instead of bronze, a wooden club instead of a proper sword, maybe just a kitchen knife and a lot of hope. The armor itself was a mixed blessing. Bronze breastplates could deflect glancing blows from spears and arrows, but they were also heavy, hot, and restrictive. In the Mediterranean heat, wearing full bronze armor was like being slowly cooked inside a metal oven. Hoplite helmets covered most of your face and head, which provided good protection but severely limited your vision and hearing. Many warriors removed their helmets during battle to see and hear better, which made them vulnerable to exactly the kinds of attacks the helmet was supposed to prevent. The famous hoplon shield was large and heavy, about 3 feet in diameter and weighing around 15 pounds. It was designed to protect not just you, but also the man fighting next to you in the phalanx formation. Dropping your shield wasn't just personal cowardice, it endangered your entire unit. But the shield was also unwieldy and exhausting to carry. After hours of marching and fighting, your left arm would be screaming in pain from holding up that bronze-covered wooden disc. Greek warfare was based on the phalanx, a formation where heavily armed infantry stood shoulder to shoulder in ranks 8 to 12 men deep. The front rank held their spears forward, creating a wall of bronze spear points. The ranks behind pushed forward, adding their weight to the formation. In theory, the phalanx was nearly unstoppable. Enemy cavalry couldn't charge a wall of spears. Light infantry couldn't penetrate the shield wall. Other phalanxes could only meet them head-on in what amounted to a massive shoving match with lethal consequences. In practice, phalanx warfare was chaotic, terrifying, and incredibly deadly. Picture this. You're standing in the front rank, shoulder to shoulder with men you may barely know, holding a 9-foot spear pointed at an enemy phalanx that's charging toward you. Behind you, 7 or more ranks of your fellow citizens are pushing you forward, whether you want to go or not. The enemy spears are getting closer. You can see the bronze spear points aimed at your chest and face. You can hear the war cries, the clashing of bronze, the screams of wounded men. You can smell the sweat, fear, and blood. And then the lines collide. The impact of 2 phalanxes meeting was devastating. Men in the front ranks were impaled on enemy spears, crushed between shields, or trampled underfoot. The bronze spear points punched through armor, flesh and bone with sickening ease. If your spear broke, and spears broke constantly in the crush of battle, you drew your sword and tried to hack at enemies who were close enough to breathe on. Combat was intensely personal and brutally violent. Wounds in phalanx battles were typically to the head, neck, and torso, the areas not protected by shields. Spear thrusts to the throat were common and usually fatal. Sword cuts to the head could split skulls open like melons. Men fought while standing on the bodies of friends and enemies alike. The ground became slippery with blood, making footing treacherous. The air was thick with dust, blood spray, and the bronze fragments that flew off damaged weapons and armor. The psychological pressure was enormous. You were trapped in the formation by the men behind you, facing enemies who were trying to kill you with bronze weapons, surrounded by the screams and death rattles of wounded comrades. Many men lost control of their bladders and bowels during battle. This was so common that it wasn't considered shameful. It was just another unpleasant aspect of warfare that everyone understood and accepted. Battle fatigue, what we would now call combat stress or PTSD, was widespread but poorly understood. Men who survived multiple battles often became withdrawn, violent, or mentally unstable. Some refused to fight again. Others became addicted to the violence and couldn't function in peacetime. But surviving the battle was only half the challenge. Ancient Greek medical care for battlefield wounds was primitive, even by the standards of the time. Arrow wounds were treated by pushing the arrow all the way through the body and pulling it out the other side, often causing more damage than the original injury. Spear wounds were packed with cloth and honey if available, or left to heal on their own if medical supplies were scarce. Broken bones from club or mace blows were set by pulling and twisting until they felt roughly correct. Amputation was performed with the same tools used for butchering animals: saws, cleavers, and large knives. All of this was done without anesthesia beyond wine and opium, assuming those were available. Most battlefield surgery was performed while the patient was conscious and screaming. Infection was almost inevitable. Battlefield conditions were filthy, medical instruments weren't sterilized, and antibiotics wouldn't be discovered for another 2 millennia. A minor wound could easily become a fatal infection. Even if you survived your wounds, you might be left permanently disabled. Ancient prosthetics were crude wooden or bronze devices that were more symbolic than functional. A warrior who lost a leg or arm was essentially retired from military service and often reduced to begging for survival. But let's say you were incredibly lucky and escaped serious injury. You still had to deal with the aftermath of battle, which was often worse than the fighting itself. Ancient warfare didn't recognize the Geneva Convention or any rules about the treatment of prisoners and civilians. When a city was captured, the male population was typically killed and the women and children were sold into slavery. This wasn't considered unusually brutal. It was standard operating procedure. The point of war was to eliminate your enemies completely, not just defeat them militarily. Siege warfare was particularly horrific. When armies couldn't capture a city by direct assault, they would surround it and wait for the defenders to starve. Sieges could last for months or years, during which time conditions inside the city became increasingly desperate. Food supplies would be exhausted first. Then people would eat leather, tree bark, grass, and eventually anything organic they could find. Cannibalism was not unheard of during long sieges. Disease was rampant in besieged cities. Overcrowding, poor sanitation, and malnutrition created perfect conditions for epidemics. Plague, dysentery, and typhoid could kill more people than enemy weapons. When cities finally fell, the survivors were often too weak to resist or flee. The massacre that followed was usually quick and thorough. Naval warfare was equally deadly, but in different ways. Greek warships were designed for ramming, using a bronze-covered wooden ram to punch holes in enemy ships. Naval battles were fast, violent, and decisive. When your ship was rammed and started sinking, your survival depended on your ability to swim, a skill that many Greeks never learned. Heavy bronze armor dragged men to the bottom of the sea. Those who managed to stay afloat might be picked up by their own ships, or they might be left to drown or be eaten by sharks. Shipwrecked sailors who made it to shore weren't necessarily safe. They might be captured and enslaved by the locals, or simply killed as unwanted foreigners. But perhaps the most terrifying aspect of ancient Greek warfare was its unpredictability. Wars could break out overnight over trivial disputes. A merchant's complaint about trade restrictions could escalate into a full-scale military conflict. A religious festival could turn into a diplomatic incident that led to invasion. You could go to bed as a peaceful citizen and wake up to find enemy troops marching toward your city. There was no early warning system, no intelligence network, no way to predict when violence might erupt. When war came, you had 3 choices: fight, flee, or die. Fighting meant risking death or maiming in brutal hand-to-hand combat. Fleeing meant abandoning everything you owned and becoming a refugee with no legal protections. Staying meant probable death when the city fell. None of these were good options. And here's the really depressing part. Even if your side won, victory often brought its own problems. Successful armies expected to be rewarded with loot, land, and slaves. If there wasn't enough plunder to go around, victorious soldiers sometimes turned on their own cities. Military commanders who became too successful were often seen as threats to the existing political order. They might be exiled, assassinated, or charged with treason by the very people they had fought to protect. So whether you won or lost, war in ancient Greece was likely to ruin your life. The best you could hope for was to survive with your body and mind intact, which was asking a lot in an age of bronze weapons and primitive medicine. But hey, at least when you weren't being stabbed with spears or dying of infected wounds, you could enjoy the rich cultural and intellectual life that ancient Athens was famous for. You know, all that philosophy and art and theater that made Greek civilization so remarkable. Except, of course, most of that cultural richness was reserved for a tiny elite of wealthy male citizens who didn't have to work for a living. For everyone else, intellectual pursuits were a luxury they couldn't afford. But we'll get to that depressing reality in our next section. So far, we've covered the charming realities of disease, starvation, legal brutality, and violent death in ancient Athens. But surely you're thinking, There must have been some compensating benefits to living in the cradle of Western civilization. All that philosophy, democracy, art, and culture had to count for something, right? Well, yes and no, mostly no. The problem is that all the amazing intellectual and cultural achievements we associate with ancient Athens were created by and for a tiny minority of the population. We're talking about maybe 5 out of 10% of the people who lived there. Everyone else was too busy trying not to die to worry about the meaning of life or the nature of justice. Let's break down Athenian society into its actual social classes, rather than the idealized version you learned about in school. At the very top were the aristocrats, old families who owned large estates outside the city and didn't have to work for money. These were the people who had time to attend symposiums, study philosophy, and participate in politics. They were educated, cultured, and completely out of touch with how normal people lived. Think of them as the ancient equivalent of trust fund kids who spend their time arguing about art and politics, while their investment portfolios pay for everything. Below the aristocrats were the wealthy merchants and manufacturers, people who had made money in trade or crafts but weren't born into noble families. They could afford good houses, slaves, and education for their children, but they were still looked down upon by the aristocrats for having to actually work for their wealth. The tension between old money and new money was just as real in ancient Athens as it is today, except with more opportunities for exile and assassination. Next came the middle class, small farmers, skilled craftsmen, and shopkeepers who owned enough property to qualify for citizenship and military service. These were the backbone of Athenian democracy, but their lives were precarious. A bad harvest, a failed business venture, or an expensive lawsuit could easily drop them into poverty. Below them were the urban poor, day laborers, unemployed citizens, and people who scraped by doing whatever work they could find. They had citizenship rights in theory, but no property, no security, and no realistic hope of improving their situation. At the bottom of the social ladder were the medics, resident foreigners, and slaves. Medics were people from other Greek cities or foreign countries who lived and worked in Athens but could never become citizens. They were essential to the economy, but had no political rights and could be expelled at any time. Slaves, of course, weren't even considered people. They were property that could be bought, sold, beaten, or killed at their owner's whim. Now, here's the crucial point. The famous Athenian democracy that we learn about in school only applied to adult male citizens who owned property. This excluded all women, roughly 50% of the population, all slaves, roughly 30 to 35% of the population, all medics and foreigners, roughly 10 to 15% of the population, all male citizens under age 30 or without property, another 5 to 10%. So when we talk about Athenian democracy, we're really talking about a system where maybe 15-20% of the population had any political rights at all. It was more like an exclusive club than a modern democracy. And even within that small group of privileged citizens, social mobility was extremely limited. If you were born poor, you almost certainly died poor. If you were born rich, you had to work pretty hard to lose your wealth and status. The education system reinforced these class divisions. Wealthy families hired private tutors to teach their sons reading, writing, mathematics, music, and physical training. These boys learned about philosophy, literature, and rhetoric, the skills needed for political and intellectual leadership. Poor families couldn't afford formal education. Their children learned whatever skills they needed for their family's trade or craft, usually through apprenticeship and direct experience. They might pick up basic literacy if they were lucky, but higher education was completely out of reach. This meant that intellectual life in Athens was largely confined to people who had inherited wealth and didn't need to work for survival. The great philosophers, writers, and artists we remember today were either wealthy themselves or sponsored by wealthy patrons. Socrates was unusual in that he came from a middle-class family. His father was a stonemason. But he was able to pursue philosophy because his wife managed their household finances while he spent his time talking to people in the agora. Most of the other famous Athenian intellectuals, Plato, Aristotle, the great playwrights and historians, came from aristocratic families or had wealthy sponsors who supported their work. This created a cultural bubble where educated elites could spend their time debating abstract questions about truth, beauty, and justice, while remaining completely insulated from the harsh realities that most people faced every day. When Plato wrote about the ideal state in his republic, he wasn't addressing the concerns of farmers struggling with failed crops or craftsmen trying to compete with slave labor. He was writing for other wealthy men who had the luxury of thinking about philosophical problems. The daily life of ordinary Athenians was dominated by work, worry, and simple survival. Let's look at what a typical day might have been like for someone from each social class. If you were an aristocrat, you woke up in a comfortable house with multiple rooms, indoor plumbing, sort of, and several slaves to handle domestic chores. You ate a substantial breakfast, spent the morning managing your estates or participating in politics, and devoted the afternoon to exercise, intellectual pursuits, or social gatherings. Your evenings might be spent at symposiums, Drinking parties where educated men discussed philosophy, poetry, and politics while being entertained by musicians and dancers. These gatherings could last all night and often involved considerable amounts of wine, sexual activity with slaves or prostitutes, and the kind of intellectual discourse that ancient Athens was famous for. If you were a middle-class citizen, your day started before dawn with work in your shop, farm, or craft business. You worked until late afternoon, handling all aspects of production, sales, and management yourself, with maybe one or two slaves to help. Your evening meal was simple: bread, olives, cheese, and wine, eaten with your family in a small house with maybe 2 or 3 rooms. Entertainment might consist of listening to a traveling storyteller in the agora, or attending a religious festival, if you could afford to take time off work. If you were poor, you woke up not knowing whether you'd find work that day or have enough money to buy food. You might spend hours waiting in the agora for someone to hire you as a day laborer, or you might try to sell whatever small goods you could make or find. Your living conditions were cramped, unsanitary, and unstable. You might share a single room with your entire family, or rent sleeping space in someone else's house. Your diet consisted mainly of barley bread, olives, and whatever scraps you could afford or scavenge. If you were a woman, your social class determined your life even more strictly than it did for men. Wealthy women lived in relative comfort, but were essentially prisoners in their own homes. They couldn't go out in public without male supervision, couldn't participate in politics or business, and spent most of their time managing households and raising children. Poor women had more freedom of movement out of necessity. They had to work to help support their families, but they were also more vulnerable to exploitation and abuse. They might work as market vendors, spinners, or domestic servants, always under the authority of male relatives or employers. Women of all social classes had virtually no legal rights. They couldn't own property, make contracts, or represent themselves in court. They were essentially transferred from their fathers to their husbands like valuable objects. Marriage was primarily an economic and political arrangement between families, rather than a romantic relationship between individuals. Wealthy families used marriages to form alliances and consolidate property. Poor families used them to pool resources and share survival burdens. Women who didn't marry, either by choice or because their families couldn't afford dowries, faced extremely limited options. They might become priestesses, prostitutes, or dependent relatives living in other people's households. Children's lives were also determined by their social class from birth. Wealthy children were pampered, educated, and prepared for lives of leisure and leadership. Poor children were put to work as soon as they were old enough to contribute to family survival. Child mortality was high across all social classes, but poor children were much more likely to die from malnutrition, disease, or accidents. Infanticide was legal and common, especially for children born with disabilities or to families who couldn't afford to raise them. The contrast between rich and poor in Athens was stark and visible. Wealthy citizens lived in large houses with courtyards, gardens, and elaborate decorations. Poor citizens lived in cramped apartments or single rooms that they often shared with animals. Rich people wore fine woolen clothing dyed in expensive colors like purple or deep red. Poor people wore undyed wool or linen that was often patched and repatched until it fell apart. The wealthy ate meat regularly, drank good wine, and could afford exotic foods imported from other regions. The poor subsisted on bread, olives, and whatever cheap protein they could find, often fish that was starting to spoil or had been preserved in salt. Social interactions were carefully regulated by class boundaries. Wealthy citizens socialized with other wealthy citizens. Poor people stuck with other poor people. Mixing across class lines was rare and often viewed with suspicion. The agora, marketplace, was one of the few places where different social classes came into regular contact. But even there, the interactions were primarily economic rather than social. Rich people bought goods from poor merchants and craftsmen, but they didn't socialize as equals. Religious festivals provided another venue for cross-class interaction. But these events reinforced social hierarchies rather than challenging them. Wealthy citizens had prominent roles in processions and ceremonies, while poor people watched from the sidelines. The famous Athenian theater that produced great tragedies and comedies was also divided by class. The wealthy sat in comfortable seats near the stage, while poor citizens were relegated to the cheap seats in the back. Slaves and women were often excluded entirely. Even the content of the plays reflected class divisions. Tragedies typically dealt with the problems of kings and heroes, people whose lives were far removed from ordinary experience. Comedies often mocked politicians and intellectuals, but they also reinforced stereotypes about women, slaves, and foreigners. So while Athens did produce remarkable cultural achievements, the benefits of that culture were distributed very unevenly. If you were born into the right family, you could enjoy a life of intellectual stimulation and artistic refinement. If you weren't, you were too busy trying to survive to worry about the finer things in life. And speaking of survival, we haven't even talked about one of the most basic challenges of ancient life: simply getting enough food and clean water to stay alive. Because even if you had money, the ancient food supply chain was unreliable, unsafe, and frequently contaminated with substances that could kill you. But that's a whole other horror story we'll explore next. All right, we've established that ancient Athens was a social nightmare where your birth circumstances determined whether you lived in relative comfort or died in abject misery. But surely you're thinking, at least the basic necessities of life, food and water, were available to everyone, right? Oh, my sweet, naive friend. Let me tell you about the ancient Greek food system, which was like playing Russian roulette with your digestive tract on a daily basis. First, let's talk about the fundamental problem. Ancient Greece couldn't feed itself. Rocky, mountainous terrain and unpredictable Mediterranean climate made large-scale agriculture difficult. Most of the land that could be farmed was already being used, and crop yields were low by modern standards. Athens, in particular, was heavily dependent on imported grain from Egypt, the Black Sea region, and other distant sources. This created a precarious situation where the city's survival depended on maintaining trade relationships with foreign powers and keeping sea routes open during times of war. When those trade relationships broke down, which happened regularly due to wars, piracy, or political disputes, Athens faced immediate food shortages. And when we say food shortages, we don't mean the price of groceries went up. We mean people started starving to death in the streets. But even when food was available, the quality and safety were questionable at best. Let's start with the staple of the ancient Greek diet, grain. Most people ate barley rather than wheat because barley was cheaper and grew better in Greek soil. This barley was ground into coarse flour using stone mills that often included pieces of the millstone itself in the final product. Eating bread made from this flour was like chewing on sandpaper seasoned with rock fragments. It wore down teeth quickly and often caused dental fractures. Many people had ground their teeth down to painful nubs by middle age. The flour was also frequently contaminated with ergot, a fungus that grows on grain and produces compounds similar to LSD. Ergot poisoning caused hallucinations, convulsions, and often death. Entire communities sometimes suffered from ergot poisoning without understanding what was causing their symptoms. Storage was another major problem. Grain had to be kept dry to prevent spoilage, but ancient storage methods were primitive. Clay jars and wooden containers couldn't completely keep out moisture, rodents, or insects. Weevils, rats, and mice regularly contaminated grain supplies. Finding bugs in your bread wasn't just common, it was expected. People developed techniques for picking insects out of flour, but they couldn't eliminate them entirely. Moldy grain was often eaten anyway because throwing away food meant risking starvation. Some molds were relatively harmless, but others produced toxins that could cause liver damage, kidney failure, or neurological problems. The bread itself was baked in communal ovens that served entire neighborhoods. These ovens were used for multiple purposes: baking bread, roasting meat, heating water, and were rarely cleaned thoroughly between uses. Cross-contamination was inevitable. Your bread might be flavored with residue from the previous day's fish, seasoned with ash from burned meat, or contaminated with whatever else had been cooked in the same oven. The water situation was even worse than the food. Athens got its water from a combination of wells, springs, and cisterns that collected rainwater. All of these sources were contaminated to varying degrees by human and animal waste. The city's sewage system consisted mainly of open drains that carried waste through the streets and eventually into streams and rivers. These same water sources were often used for drinking water downstream. Public fountains were supposed to provide clean water, but they were fed by the same contaminated sources and were themselves breeding grounds for bacteria and parasites. The water sat in stone basins that were rarely cleaned and were used by hundreds of people daily. People brought containers to fill at these fountains, and the same containers were used for multiple purposes: carrying water, storing oil, holding wine. They were washed infrequently and incompletely. Waterborne diseases were rampant. Cholera, typhoid, dysentery, and various parasitic infections were facts of life. The ancient Greeks knew that water could make people sick, but they had no understanding of bacteria, viruses, or proper sanitation. Their solution was to avoid drinking water whenever possible, preferring wine, which was safer because the alcohol killed some harmful microorganisms. But even wine had its problems. Ancient Greek wine was nothing like modern wine. It was thick, syrupy, and incredibly strong, often 15-20% alcohol by volume. It was usually mixed with water before drinking, but the water used for mixing was often contaminated. Wine was also adulterated with various substances to improve flavor, color, or shelf life. Lead was commonly used as a sweetener and preservative, causing chronic lead poisoning in regular wine drinkers. Symptoms included abdominal pain, kidney damage, and neurological problems. Other wine additives included pine resin, herbs, spices, and various minerals. Some of these were harmless, but others were toxic. There was no regulation of wine production and no way for consumers to know what they were drinking. Let's move on to other foods in the ancient Greek diet. Olive oil was essential for cooking, but it went rancid quickly in the hot climate. Rancid oil doesn't just taste terrible, it can cause digestive problems and may contribute to various health issues. Olives themselves were preserved in brine, so salty it could cause dehydration and high blood pressure. The salt used for preservation was often contaminated with impurities that added their own health risks. Cheese was made from goat or sheep milk and aged without refrigeration. The aging process often involved beneficial bacteria, but it also allowed harmful bacteria to flourish. Food poisoning from spoiled cheese was common. Meat was a luxury for most people, eaten only on special occasions or religious festivals. When animals were slaughtered, the entire carcass had to be consumed quickly before it spoiled. There was no refrigeration, no effective preservation methods beyond salting or smoking. This meant that meat was often eaten in various stages of decay. Fresh meat might be several days old and starting to turn. People developed strong stomachs out of necessity, but food poisoning was still frequent. Fish was more common than meat, especially in coastal cities like Athens, but fish spoiled even faster than meat, and the lack of ice or refrigeration meant that fresh fish was often anything but fresh. Fish was preserved by salting, smoking, or fermentation. These preservation methods created products that were incredibly salty, often rancid, and sometimes toxic. Fish sauce, a fermented fish product similar to modern Asian fish sauces, was popular but frequently contaminated with harmful bacteria. Shellfish were particularly dangerous. Mussels, oysters, and other mollusks were often harvested from polluted waters near cities, where they concentrated toxins and disease-causing organisms. Shellfish poisoning could cause paralysis, respiratory failure, and death. Vegetables and fruits were seasonal and often scarce. Without modern agricultural techniques, storage methods, or transportation systems, fresh produce was only available when it was locally in season. Most vegetables were smaller, tougher, and more bitter than modern varieties. Selective breeding hadn't yet created the sweet, tender vegetables we're used to. An ancient Greek carrot was small, woody, and barely edible. Cabbage was coarse and bitter. Onions could make you cry from across the room. Fruits faced similar problems. Ancient Greek apples were small, sour, and often wormy. Grapes were either fresh and only available during harvest season, or dried into raisins. Figs were sweet but spoiled quickly and were often filled with insects. Honey was the primary sweetener, but it was expensive and often adulterated with other substances. Fake honey made from grape syrup or other sugary substances was common, and consumers had no way to tell the difference. Nuts and legumes provided protein for those who couldn't afford meat, but they were also problematic. Nuts went rancid quickly in the hot climate. Legumes like lentils and beans were often infested with insects or contaminated with mold. Cooking methods were primitive and dangerous. Most cooking was done over open fires using wood or charcoal as fuel. Controlling temperature was difficult and burns were common. Cooking pots were made of clay and often contained lead glazes that leached into food. Bronze and iron cookware could also contaminate food with toxic metals. The lack of understanding about food safety meant that cross-contamination was constant. The same knives, cutting boards, and cooking surfaces were used for raw meat, vegetables, and other foods without proper cleaning between uses. Preservation methods were equally primitive and risky. Salting was the most common preservation technique, but it required huge amounts of salt and often failed to prevent spoilage. Smoking worked better, but required careful control of temperature and humidity. Fermentation was used to preserve various foods, but the process was poorly understood and often went wrong. Botulism, alcoholic poisoning, and other fermentation-related illnesses were common. Food storage was a constant challenge. Without refrigeration, airtight containers, or effective pest control, keeping food safe to eat required constant vigilance and frequent failure. Grain was stored in large clay jars that couldn't completely exclude moisture, rodents, or insects. Oil was kept in similar containers and often went rancid before it could be consumed. Wine was stored in wooden barrels or clay amphoras that could crack, leak, or become contaminated. The result of all these food safety issues was that gastrointestinal illnesses were incredibly common. Stomach pain, diarrhea, vomiting, and food poisoning were regular parts of life for most ancient Greeks. Chronic malnutrition was also widespread, especially among the poor. A diet based primarily on barley bread, olives, and occasional fish didn't provide adequate nutrition for growing children or working adults. Vitamin deficiencies caused various health problems. Scurvy from lack of vitamin C was common among people who couldn't afford fresh fruits. Rickets from vitamin D deficiency affected children who didn't get enough sunlight or proper nutrition. Iron deficiency anemia was widespread, especially among women who lost iron through menstruation and childbirth. The ancient Greek diet was low in easily absorbed iron, and chronic blood loss from parasites made the problem worse. Protein deficiency stunted growth and development in children and left adults weak and susceptible to disease. The poor quality protein available from ancient grains and legumes wasn't sufficient for optimal health. But perhaps the most terrifying aspect of the ancient Greek food system was its complete unpredictability. You never knew when your next meal might be your last, either because food would become unavailable or because what you ate would poison you. Famines were regular occurrences. Bad weather, crop diseases, or disrupted trade routes could create food shortages that killed thousands of people. During famines, people ate whatever they could find: tree bark, grass, leather, and sometimes each other. Even during normal times, food quality was inconsistent and potentially dangerous. Every meal was a gamble. The bread might be contaminated with ergot. The wine might be adulterated with lead. The fish might be spoiled. The water might be full of deadly bacteria. This constant uncertainty about food safety and availability created a level of anxiety about basic survival that's hard for modern people to understand. When getting enough safe food to eat is a daily challenge, higher pursuits like philosophy and art become luxuries that few can afford. And we haven't even talked about what happened when you got old in ancient Greece, because if you think surviving to middle age was difficult, wait until you hear about what passed for elder care in a society where old people were often viewed as useless burdens rather than respected elders. But that's another delightful topic we'll explore next. So you've somehow managed to survive childhood diseases, malnutrition, food poisoning, workplace accidents, military service, and the general brutality of daily life in ancient Athens. Congratulations, you're now approaching what the Greeks considered old age, which, depending on your social class and luck, might be anywhere from your late 30s to your early 50s, and that's when things get really depressing. In ancient Greece, growing old wasn't seen as achieving wisdom and earning respect. It was viewed as becoming increasingly useless, burdensome, and disgusting. The Greeks had a saying, "Those whom the gods love die young." This wasn't just a poetic sentiment, it reflected a genuine belief that death in youth was preferable to the indignities of old age. The physical reality of aging in ancient Greece was brutal beyond modern comprehension. Without proper nutrition, medical care, or understanding of how to maintain health, people aged rapidly and often painfully. By your 40s, if you were lucky enough to reach them, your body was already breaking down in ways that would shock a modern person. Decades of poor nutrition had left your bones brittle and your muscles weak. Your teeth, if you still had any, were ground down to painful nubs from eating coarse bread filled with stone fragments. Your joints ached constantly from years of manual labor and minor injuries that never healed properly. Your back was permanently bent from carrying heavy loads and working in cramped positions. Your hands were gnarled and scarred from a lifetime of working with primitive tools. Your skin was weathered and aged by constant exposure to sun, wind, and harsh working conditions. Without sunscreen, moisturizers, or protective clothing, people looked decades older than their actual age. Your vision was probably failing due to eye diseases, injuries, or simple aging. There were no eyeglasses, contact lenses, or cataract surgery. When your vision went bad, you just had to cope as best you could. Your hearing might be damaged from years of exposure to loud noises, metalworking, construction, warfare, without any hearing protection. Partial or complete deafness was common among older people. For women, the situation was even worse. Multiple pregnancies and childbirths in unsanitary conditions often left women with permanent health problems. Prolapsed uteruses, torn pelvic muscles, and chronic infections were common consequences of childbirth without proper medical care. The psychological aspects of aging were equally challenging. In a society that valued physical strength and capability above all else, becoming weak and dependent was seen as shameful. Old people were often viewed as burdens who consumed resources without contributing anything useful. Family structures in ancient Greece were based on economic necessity rather than emotional bonds. Children cared for aging parents because they were legally and socially obligated to do so, not necessarily out of love or respect. If you were poor and had no children to care for you, your old age prospects were grim. There were no nursing homes, social security systems, or government assistance programs. You might end up begging in the streets or dying alone in whatever shelter you could find. Even wealthy elderly people faced challenges. While they might have slaves to care for their physical needs, they often became isolated and irrelevant as younger family members took over control of property and decision-making. The Greek concept of a good death was very different from modern ideas. A good death was one that came quickly in battle, during childbirth or from sudden illness. Dying slowly from old age was considered undignified and pitiable. This attitude influenced how people planned for their later years. Rather than saving money for retirement or making arrangements for long-term care, many people simply assumed they would die before reaching extreme old age. When people did live to advanced ages, say their 60s or 70s, they were often seen as curiosities or even omens. Extreme longevity was sometimes attributed to divine favor, but it was just as often viewed with suspicion. Ancient Greek medicine had no understanding of the aging process or how to manage age-related health problems. Elderly people were basically told to accept their declining health as inevitable and prepare for death. Pain management for old people was non-existent beyond whatever alcohol or opium they could afford. Chronic conditions like arthritis, kidney stones, or heart problems were simply endured until death provided relief. Mental health in old age was poorly understood and rarely treated with compassion. People with dementia or other cognitive disorders were often assumed to be possessed by evil spirits or cursed by the gods. The social isolation of elderly people was compounded by the physical layout of ancient Greek cities. Houses were built for young, able-bodied people. There were no accessibility modifications for those with mobility problems. Steps were steep, doorways were narrow, and there were no handrails or other safety features. An elderly person who had trouble walking might become effectively housebound. The economic reality for most elderly people was harsh. In a society without pensions or retirement savings, people worked until they physically couldn't continue. When they could no longer work, they became dependent on family charity or public assistance. Public assistance in ancient Athens was minimal and came with significant social stigma. Accepting charity was seen as a mark of failure and shame. For elderly women, the situation was particularly difficult. Women who outlived their husbands often had no legal rights to property or inheritance. They might be left completely destitute, despite having worked their entire lives. Widows were sometimes forced to remarry, regardless of their age or preferences, simply to have someone legally responsible for their care. The idea of an independent elderly woman was almost unthinkable. The treatment of elderly slaves was especially brutal. When slaves became too old or sick to work effectively, they were often simply abandoned to die. There was no economic incentive to care for unproductive slaves, and no legal requirement to provide for their welfare. Some lucky elderly slaves might be freed by their owners as an act of charity, but freedom without resources or family support was often a death sentence for old people who couldn't care for themselves. Religious attitudes toward aging were mixed. While some traditions honored elderly priests and priestesses for their wisdom and experience, popular religion often portrayed old age as a punishment from the gods. The Greek pantheon itself reflected these attitudes. The gods were typically portrayed as eternally young and beautiful. Old age was associated with minor deities and monsters rather than major gods. Funeral customs in ancient Greece reflected the society's complex relationship with death and aging. While elaborate funeral rituals were important for maintaining family honor and ensuring proper passage to the afterlife, the actual care of dying people was often minimal. Many people died without medical attention, pain relief, or even basic comfort. The emphasis was on preparing for death ritually rather than making the dying process more bearable. The famous Greek philosophical discussions about death and the afterlife were largely irrelevant to ordinary people, who were focused on the immediate practical challenges of survival and aging. When philosophers like Socrates talked about death as a release from the sufferings of life, they were speaking primarily to educated elites who had the luxury of contemplating abstract questions about mortality. For most people, death wasn't a philosophical problem to be pondered. It was a constant practical threat that could arrive at any moment through disease, accident, violence, or simple old age. The uncertainty of life expectancy also affected how people made long-term plans. Without reliable ways to predict how long they might live, people couldn't plan for retirement, make long-term investments, or prepare for extended periods of dependency. This created a cycle where people focused on immediate survival rather than long-term planning, which made them even more vulnerable to the challenges of aging. But perhaps the most depressing aspect of aging in ancient Greece was the complete lack of hope for improvement. There were no medical advances on the horizon, no social programs being developed, no cultural changes that might make old age more bearable. People knew that getting old meant becoming weak, sick, poor, and irrelevant. There was no expectation that things could be different or better. This hopelessness was reflected in Greek literature and art, which rarely portrayed old age as anything other than a tragedy to be endured. The few positive portrayals of elderly people typically focused on their past achievements rather than their present circumstances. So if you somehow managed to survive to old age in ancient Athens, you could look forward to years of physical pain, social isolation, economic insecurity, and general irrelevance. Your own family would view you as a burden, society would see you as useless, and your body would betray you in increasingly painful ways. And when death finally came, from disease, accident, or simple exhaustion, it would probably be neither quick nor painless. You might die alone, in pain and forgotten by everyone except whoever had to dispose of your body. But hey, at least the afterlife couldn't be worse than what you'd already endured, right? Well, about that, the ancient Greek conception of the afterlife wasn't exactly comforting. But that's a topic for our final section, where we'll explore what the Greeks believed happened after you died, and why it probably wasn't worth looking forward to. All right, so you've endured childhood in ancient Athens with its rampant disease and malnutrition. You've survived the brutal working conditions, the primitive medical care, the legal system that treated you like property, and the constant threat of warfare. You've somehow made it through middle age despite the contaminated food and water, and you've experienced the indignities of growing old in a society that views elderly people as useless burdens. Now you're finally dying. Surely, you think, death will bring relief from all this suffering. The afterlife has got to be better than the hell you've been living through, right? Oh, you sweet, optimistic soul. Let me tell you about the ancient Greek view of death and what comes after, because it's somehow even more depressing than everything we've covered so far. Let's start with the process of dying itself. because even that was more unpleasant in ancient Greece than you might expect. Most people died at home in the same small, cramped, unsanitary rooms where they had lived. There were no hospitals, no hospices, no medical facilities designed to make dying more comfortable. If you were lucky, a family member might sit with you. If you weren't, you died alone. Pain management during terminal illness was essentially non-existent. There were no morphine drips, no palliative care specialists, no understanding of how to make dying less agonizing. If you could afford wine or opium, those might dull the pain slightly. If you couldn't, you just suffered until the end. The dying process was often prolonged and gruesome. Without modern medicine to either cure diseases or ease the dying process, people frequently lingered for weeks or months in agony. Cancer, kidney failure, heart disease, and infections all caused slow, painful deaths. Family members had to watch their loved ones waste away, unable to do anything to help. The psychological trauma of witnessing prolonged suffering without being able to provide relief was just another aspect of the general brutality of ancient life. When death finally came, the body had to be prepared for burial quickly because there was no refrigeration or embalming. In hot weather, decomposition began almost immediately, creating health hazards for the living. The funeral customs themselves were elaborate and expensive, which created additional burdens for grieving families. Proper funeral rites were considered essential for ensuring the deceased's passage to the afterlife, but they could bankrupt families who were already struggling financially. Bodies were washed, anointed with oils, and dressed in their best clothing. Professional mourners were hired to wail and lament during the funeral procession. The body was either buried or cremated, depending on family preferences and local customs. All of this had to happen within a few days of death, and the costs were substantial. Families often went into debt to provide proper funerals for their relatives, adding financial stress to emotional grief. But the really depressing part comes when we look at what the ancient Greeks believed happened after all these expensive funeral rites were completed. According to Greek mythology and popular belief, the souls of the dead went to Hades, not the Christian hell of fire and brimstone, but a shadowy underworld ruled by the god of the same name. And this afterlife was not great. The journey to Hades began with crossing the river Styx, which required paying the ferryman Charon for passage. This is why Greeks placed coins on the eyes or in the mouths of the dead to pay for the boat ride. If you couldn't afford the fare, your soul was stuck wandering the shores of the river for 100 years before being allowed to cross. So even in death, your economic status mattered. Once you made it across the river, you faced judgment by 3 judges of the dead, Minos, Rhadamanthus, and Iacchus. These judges determined where your soul would spend eternity based on how you had lived your life. But here's the thing about ancient Greek ideas of justice in the afterlife. They were just as arbitrary and unfair as justice in the mortal world. The vast majority of souls, basically everyone who wasn't either extraordinarily heroic or extraordinarily evil, were sent to the asphodel fields. This was essentially a vast, gray plain where souls wandered aimlessly for eternity. The asphodel fields weren't torture, but they weren't paradise either. They were just nothing. Eternal boredom in a colorless, joyless existence where nothing ever happened and nothing ever changed. Your soul retained some memory of your mortal life, but only enough to make you sad about what you'd lost. You could see other souls, but couldn't really interact with them meaningfully. You had no body, no physical sensations, no ability to affect anything in the world of the living. It was like being stuck in the waiting room of eternity, forever. The few souls who were judged to have lived exceptionally virtuous lives got to go to the Elysian fields, also called Elysium, which was basically ancient Greek heaven. But the standards for getting into Elysium were impossibly high and often arbitrary. You had to be not just good, but extraordinarily good, and usually famous or important as well. Heroes who died in glorious battles, kings who ruled justly, and people who had performed great services to the gods might qualify for Elysium. But ordinary people who lived decent, moral lives? Nope. Off to the gray monotony of asphodel with you. The truly evil souls were sent to Tartarus, which was the punishment section of the underworld. This was reserved for people who had committed crimes against the gods, or particularly heinous acts like patricide or betraying guests. Tartarus was indeed a place of eternal torment, with creative punishments designed to fit specific crimes. Tantalus was eternally hungry and thirsty, but could never reach the food and water that appeared just out of reach. Sisyphus was condemned to push a boulder up a hill for eternity, only to have it roll back down just before he reached the top. But here's the thing. You really had to work hard to get into Tartarus. Simple murder, theft, or even cruelty wasn't enough. You had to offend the gods directly or commit crimes that violated the most fundamental social taboos. So most people, regardless of how they had lived their mortal lives, could look forward to an eternity of meaningless wandering in a gray wasteland where nothing interesting ever happened. This wasn't exactly a comforting prospect for people who were already suffering through difficult lives. The promise of eternal boredom after death didn't provide much motivation to endure present hardships, but it gets worse. According to some versions of Greek mythology, souls in the underworld retained their earthly wounds and disabilities. So if you died of disease, you might spend eternity sick. If you were injured in battle, you could be eternally wounded. Your soul might look like your body did at the moment of death, which, given ancient Greek medical care and living conditions, was usually not great. There were also various monsters and dangers in the underworld that could torment souls even after death. The Furies hunted down those who had committed unpunished crimes. Cerberus, the three-headed dog, guarded the gates to prevent souls from escaping back to the world of the living. The geography of Hades was designed to be unpleasant and disorienting. There were rivers of fire, swamps of despair, and endless gray plains where landmarks never changed. Souls could wander for eons without finding anything interesting or meaningful to do. Some mystery religions, like the Eleusinian mysteries, promised initiates better treatment in the afterlife. But these religions required expensive initiation ceremonies that most people couldn't afford, and their promises were often vague and contradictory. The philosophical schools had different ideas about death and the afterlife, but these were intellectual exercises for educated elites rather than practical comfort for ordinary people facing mortality. Epicurus taught that death was simply the end of consciousness. When you died, you stopped existing, so there was nothing to fear. But this wasn't particularly comforting to people who wanted to believe they would see their loved ones again. The Stoics preached acceptance of death as a natural part of life, but their philosophy required a level of emotional detachment that was difficult for most people to achieve. Plato's ideas about the immortality of the soul and reincarnation offered some hope for eventual improvement, but his complex metaphysical theories were incomprehensible to most people and offered no guarantees about what form that improvement might take. The practical result of all these competing and mostly depressing views of the afterlife was that most ancient Greeks faced death with resignation rather than hope. They didn't expect anything particularly good to happen after they died, but they didn't expect anything particularly bad either. Just endless, meaningless existence in a gray void. This lack of hope for a better afterlife had profound effects on how people lived their mortal lives. If you couldn't count on divine justice or eternal reward for good behavior, then earthly justice and immediate pleasure became more important. Some people responded to this by trying to pack as much enjoyment as possible into their short lives. Others became fatalistic and resigned to whatever fate brought them. Still others focused on leaving behind a good reputation or having their names remembered after death. But for most people, the prospect of a boring afterlife just added another layer of depression to lives that were already difficult enough. The uncertainty about what actually happened after death was also psychologically disturbing. Unlike later Christian theology, which provided detailed descriptions of heaven and hell, Greek beliefs about the afterlife were fragmentary and contradictory. Different regions had different traditions, different social classes had different expectations, different religious cults promised different outcomes. There was no authoritative scripture or doctrine that could provide definitive answers about what to expect after death. This uncertainty made grief even more painful for the living. When someone you loved died, you couldn't be sure where they had gone or what was happening to them. You might worry that they were suffering in Tartarus, or feel sad that they were bored in Asphodel, or wonder if they had somehow made it to Elysium. The lack of clear answers about the afterlife also made it difficult to find meaning in suffering. If there was no guarantee that good people would be rewarded after death, then what was the point of trying to live a moral life? Some people found comfort in the mystery religions or philosophical schools, but these options were expensive and often contradictory. Most people just had to cope with uncertainty about death on top of all the other uncertainties of ancient life. The rituals surrounding death provided some comfort for the living, but they were also reminders of mortality and the inevitability of loss. Funeral processions, tomb monuments, and annual commemorations of the dead kept death constantly visible in daily life. Ancient Greek cemeteries were located outside city walls, but were still visible to travelers and residents. Walking past rows of tombstones was a daily reminder that everyone would eventually join the dead in their gray, boring afterlife. So there you have it, the ancient Greek view of death and what comes after. After a lifetime of suffering, hardship, and struggle, you could look forward to an eternity of meaningless wandering in a colorless void where nothing interesting ever happened. It's hard to imagine a more depressing way to think about mortality. Even the worst versions of hell in later religious traditions at least offered the possibility of dramatic suffering, which is more interesting than eternal boredom. The ancient Greeks managed to create a conception of the afterlife that was neither terrifying enough to motivate good behavior nor pleasant enough to provide comfort in times of grief. It was just bleak. And that, in many ways, perfectly captures the essence of life in ancient Athens. Brutal, arbitrary, and ultimately pointless. You suffered through a short, difficult life and then spent eternity being bored in a gray wasteland. No wonder the Greeks invented tragedy as an art form. Their entire worldview was basically one long tragic story with no hope of a happy ending. So, there we have it, folks. We've taken a comprehensive tour through the reality of life in ancient Athens, the diseases, the food poisoning, the workplace accidents, the legal brutality, the constant threat of violence, the social oppression, the primitive medicine, the economic insecurity, and the promise of eternal boredom after death. And honestly, we've barely scratched the surface. We haven't even talked about the rampant slavery, the complete subjugation of women, the casual acceptance of infanticide, or the regular practice of human sacrifice during certain religious festivals. We haven't discussed the parasites that lived in most people's intestines, the lead poisoning from contaminated wine and cookware, or the respiratory diseases caused by living in cities filled with smoke from cooking fires and workshops. We haven't covered the random violence of daily life in a society where carrying weapons was normal and settling disputes through combat was acceptable. We haven't mentioned the complete lack of privacy, personal space, or individual rights that modern people take for granted. Let me ask you this. What time is it where you're watching this? Take a moment to look around you. You probably have electric lights, clean water from a tap, food that was refrigerated and inspected for safety, clothes that were mass-produced to fit your body, and shelter that protects you from the elements. You live in a world with antibiotics, anesthesia, and emergency medical care. You have access to education regardless of your social class. You can vote, speak freely, and choose your own career path. You can communicate instantly with people around the world and access virtually unlimited information. You live longer, eat better, work in safer conditions, and have more opportunities than the wealthiest aristocrats of ancient Athens could have imagined. But here's the thing that really gets me. Despite all the horrors we've discussed, some people did survive and even thrive in ancient Athens. They created art, philosophy, literature, and political innovations that still influence us today. They built the foundation of Western civilization while dealing with problems that would crush most modern people within days. They found ways to create meaning, beauty, and progress in circumstances that were almost unimaginably difficult. The ancient Greeks weren't superhumans. They were people just like us, with the same basic needs, desires, and fears that humans have always had. They just lived in a world that was indifferent to those needs and actively hostile to their survival. What does that tell us about human resilience, adaptability, and the capacity to find hope even in the darkest circumstances? Maybe it suggests that our ancestors were tougher than we give them credit for, not because they were physically stronger or morally superior, but because they had no choice but to adapt to conditions that would seem impossible to us. Or maybe it reminds us that progress isn't inevitable or permanent. The comfortable, safe world we live in today is the result of thousands of years of gradual improvements in technology, social organization, and human knowledge. It's not guaranteed to continue, and it's not enjoyed by everyone even now. Understanding how our ancestors lived, really understanding the daily reality of their struggles, might help us appreciate what we have, while also recognizing how much work remains to be done. There are still places in the world where people face conditions similar to those we've described in ancient Athens. There are still societies where clean water is scarce, medical care is primitive, education is limited to the wealthy, and legal systems are arbitrary and corrupt. The problems we've explored tonight aren't just historical curiosities. They're ongoing human challenges that we haven't completely solved, even with all our modern advantages. So the next time you flip a light switch, drink a glass of tap water, take an aspirin for a headache, or vote in an election, remember that these simple acts represent victories over problems that tormented our ancestors for thousands of years. And maybe, just maybe, think about what we can do to extend those victories to the people who still don't have access to the basic necessities and rights that we take for granted. Because if there's one thing our journey through ancient Athens should teach us, it's that human suffering isn't noble or romantic. It's just suffering. And if we have the power to reduce it, we probably should. Thanks for watching, everyone. Let me know in the comments what surprised you most about life in ancient Athens, and what aspects of modern life you're most grateful for after hearing this. And, as always, if you enjoyed this deep dive into historical reality, hit that like button and subscribe for more content that will make you appreciate your boring, comfortable modern life. Until next time, stay curious, stay grateful, and stay glad you live in the 21st century.